Hello everyone! My project was on the Cambrian Explosion. This event was a significant process that impacted life on Earth as we know it. From the fast rate of organism growth to the sheer amount of organisms that were present, learning about this topic should be mandatory in classes such as ours. Completing this project was a lot more interesting than I expected, so I hope it has the same outcome for you. So without further ado, let's get started. So what was the Cambrian Explosion? It was not an actual explosion, but an explosion in organism diversity from around 543 to 490 million years ago. It's considered a breakthrough for complex life, as organisms were now obtaining hard parts like skeletons and shells. This meant a significant influx of fossils found from this period. As with most life at the time, the Cambrian explosion occurred in shallow seas as land animals weren't around until 350 million years ago. Another important upgrade during the Cambrian explosion was the change from prokaryotes to eukaryotes. This means that organisms were now multicelled and had organelles. Most importantly, they had a membrane-enclosed nucleus that could store genetic information. It's important to note that this event was not the origin of life on Earth, but the evolution of it. In simple terms, the Cambrian explosion is classified as a sudden appearance of most phyla that we see today. In case you need a refresher, I've inserted a photo listing the taxonomic ranks. As you can see, phylum is the third largest class. In addition, there seems to be a recurring question in a lot of my sources. Are phyla in the Cambrian explosion really that sudden, or were they already existing organisms that were now able to grow hard parts and therefore be fossilized? The answer that I found is that the fossils found were too abrupt, or that the organisms would have been staggered if they had already existed. Phyla that now used hard parts should have evolved after they got the shells, but this didn't happen. It was just everything at once. This chart shows just how diverse the Cambrian explosion was. Dotted lines represent the probable range of phyla. Solid lines represent data backed up with fossil evidence. Crosses represent groups that are now extinct. When looking at the chart, we can see that the body plan of major phyla had already evolved by the time of the Burgess Shale, which means it only had fossils from the end of the Cambrian explosion. It's interesting because the Burgess Shale is known for its vast amount of fossils. This indicates that even a small amount of time during this period produced so many new organisms. Knowing what the Earth's situation was before this event is important to understanding it. Before the Cambrian explosion, only primitive life existed, so organisms like worms and jellyfish. As stated before, the entire explosion occurred from 543 to 490 million years ago. This means it was preceded by the Ediacaran period, which was the end of the Proterozoic eon, and led to the Phanerozoic eon, or the one that we're currently in. It's worth noting that there was a glaciation near the end of this period that may have contributed to the rapid growth. On the other hand, the explosion was succeeded by the Ordovician period as well. So based on our knowledge of these periods of time, this means that Rodinia had broken up and Laurentia and Gondwana were starting to form. I included this picture just to give a visual image of what I was talking about on the previous slide. As you can see, the Cambrian explosion hosted a lot of events, one hint at its importance in geological history. I found an interesting graphic that I was compelled to include. This photo solidifies just how significant the Cambrian explosion really was in Earth's history. You can see a huge increase in the number of phyla compared to the amount that existed before it. This growth then plateaus in the Ordovician. Based on that graphic, I wanted to add some more points that make the Cambrian explosion unique when compared to other organism evolution periods. The Cambrian explosion was the fastest rate of organism growth ever seen before, and it still holds that record. In addition, during this time, organisms were not only changed physically, but internally as well. On a microscopic level, their cells were changed from unicellular to multicellular. It was also responsible for the first fish to appear, and I'll show you guys some examples later on. The Cambrian explosion was also unique for challenging Darwin's theory of natural selection. In Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, he discusses the theory of natural selection with the following quote. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but I think the last sentence is very important. It says, "From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form." Some people claim that since almost all of the animal phyla appear in the Cambrian explosion without evidence of evolution, Darwin's theory is incorrect. However, a more recent study determined that the evolution rates during the Cambrian explosion were within the boundaries of normal evolutionary processes, since the lifespan of Cambrian organisms were relatively short. This chart further explains what I was talking about on the previous slide, but particularly for the opposing side. Even though more current research disproves it, it's still worth mentioning the evidence presented by both sides. As you can see, Darwin's theory suggests that evolution runs at a slower and more continuous rate, branching out in morphology as time goes on. In the actual data, evolution during the Cambrian explosion shows a much more straight trend, going almost directly vertical. In addition, the morphology does not branch out as much, but differentiates as phylums. So next, let's talk about the theorized causes of the Cambrian explosion. Basically, scientists wanted to know, is evolution more genetic or is it caused by environment? Starting with the environmental side, there are three major theories. The first is that the oxygen levels around the globe allowed hard parts to form. In other terms, increased oxygen from a glaciation period passed a specific threshold that allowed harder shells and skeletons to develop as they required more oxygen in the atmosphere than what was there previously. The second theory is that a ton of nutrients became available that allowed this fast growth to happen. This theory explained how the breakup of rodinia increased the rate of seafloor spreading and produced warmer, less dense water. This water rose, and as a result sea level rose, making more shallow sea areas. This shallower water was now the perfect environment for more complex life to develop, as nutrients that were originally at the bottom of the ocean were then recycled into mid-ocean ridges existing at the time that were disturbed by the plates moving. The third theory is that global temperatures evened out after the previous glaciation and warmed up enough to allow rapid growth to occur. Next is biological theories, of which there are two. The first is that hard parts became essential for life during this period of time. The second is that global environment in this period favored larger sizes. These can both be supported by the idea that increased predation made mobility and size very important for survival. There's also the idea that the Cambrian explosion was caused by a mix of all these causes, though as of today, the stance that has the most support seems to be the theory that increased oxygen levels allowed hard parts to develop. Support for this theory indicates an overall environmental cause for evolution. This next part includes examples of organisms that existed during this period and some evidence that we found of them. In the chart located on the slide, there are some examples of the phyla that emerged during the Cambrian explosion. Though I couldn't find enough evidence for a species in every one of these phyla, the ones I'll be specifically focused on are Chordata, Mollusca, Arthropoda, and also one that's not on here called Lobopodia. First up are trilobites. These organisms are in the phylum Arthropoda and are probably the most recognizable for geologists. I'm also going to include size comparisons on each slide, though most of the examples I'm going to show you are small. Trilobites came in many different shapes and sizes, with over 20,000 species, so providing fossil images for each and every one of them would be virtually impossible. Though a fun fact is that many trilobites would curl up in a ball for protection, as seen in the middle image. As such, a lot of fossils of these guys are round. So next is Hallucigenia. You may recognize this one from class. He belongs to the Lobopodia phylum. So no one knows what the spines on their backs were made of, or if they even provided protection. Also, this organism is apparently a species of velvet worm. Anomalocaris is next, and it's the largest sized species in this entire presentation. This one might also be recognizable from class. These belong to the Arthropoda phylum. This guy was believed to be a predator, as some trilobites were found with bite marks resembling Anomalocaris mouths. Their feces were also examined and had pieces of trilobite shells. This is Wawaxia, hailing from the Mollusca phylum. These were way smaller than I expected. Their mouths, located on their underside, had rows of sharp teeth that could be used to scrape algae off the seafloor. They also relied on touch and smell, as it's been determined that they were blind. Wawaxia is most related to common-day snails and slugs. Next is Morella, belonging to the Arthropoda phylum, just like trilobites. Again, these were way smaller than expected. The fossils for this organism are shown below. Its head has two antennae used to feel out its surroundings. Surprisingly, or maybe not to some people, these organisms are related to spiders and shrimp. One of the fishes from the Cambrian explosion has a name that I'm definitely going to butcher, but it's called Hycuichthyes. These fish belong to the Chordata phylum. Conodonts are also from this phylum, if you know those creepy eel-like creatures. The fossils for these fish are relatively simple and expected, but the fish species has a distinct head that's used to identify it. Pikaia are snail-like organisms classified in the Chordata phylum as well. Their fossils are pretty simple. They were around 40 millimeters in length and swim above the seafloor. They lack joints and an exoskeleton, so they were originally identified as a worm. Next is Opabina, perhaps the cutest organism to come out of this period in my opinion. They belong to the Arthropoda phylum. These guys were quite strange, as they had 5 eyes and a flexible trunk with a claw at the end. They sound and look terrifying, but just remember that they were around the size of a mouse. Last is Canidaspis, an interesting looking organism from the Arthropoda phylum. To me, their fossils almost look like horseshoe crabs, but unlike horseshoe crabs, they would move along the seafloor in a rippling motion to push water past their gills. This action helped them breathe. Moving on, there are 2 significant sources of fossils from the Cambrian Explosion. The first is one that should be familiar, the Burgess Shale Formation. This formation is found in the Canadian Rockies in Canada. It's famous around the globe for its many museum-quality samples, specifically organisms like the trilobites seen in the large photo. This chart shows the relative abundance of specimens found in the Burgess Shale Formation, specifically at a site known as Walcott Quarry. Some of the phyla here should be recognizable, including mollusca and arthropoda. If you realize that most of the species I talked about a couple of slides ago were arthropoda, good for you, glad you're listening. Based on this chart, I think you can see why I included so many arthropoda, as they are the most common specimens found at the Burgess Shale Formation. Though the Burgess Shale Formation is not the only site to find fossil evidence for the Cambrian Explosion, it is one of the biggest and therefore holds more weight statistically. Here are some fossils found at the Burgess Shale Formation. Some of these photos were used in other slides, and some you might recognize based on those slides. This one is Anomalocaris. This one is a benthic sponge. This is Nectocaris, related to mollusks. This is one that we've seen in class and should remember by its hairy-looking appearance. It's called Canada spinosa. These are Picaya, if they look familiar to you. This spindly-looking creature is named Portalia mira. And remember, all of these were existing at the very end of the Cambrian Explosion. The other location you may not have heard of is the Chenzheng fossil site. This site is located in the Yunnan province of China, specifically in the villages of Erkakan and Chenzheng. Fossils from this site have high-quality specimens from the Cambrian Explosion, but are older than those of the Burgess Shale Formation. These are some fossils that were found in the Chenzheng fossil site. Again, they may look very familiar to previous slides' pictures. Pictures from this site are less in quantity and quality, so please bear with me. This is a type of lobopodian, so it's related to hallucigenia. This is a very low-quality Anomalocaris. This is an Isoxus, one of my personal favorites. You should probably know what this one is, but in case you don't, it's a portion of a trilobite. This is a Wapita, another interesting organism. And this is another type of lobopodians. To reiterate, these are older than the Burgess Shale Formation. This means that the fossils found here should have some slight differences when compared to the ones found at the Burgess Shale Formation. Some other locations that feature fossils from the Cambrian Explosion include the Pioche Formation in Nevada, House Range, Utah, and Sirius Peshet, Greenland. Though these formations do not have the same level of quality as the locations mentioned on the previous slides, they still house many quality fossils from the Cambrian Explosion. In my personal opinion, they'd be worth making stops at on a road trip. Here are some fossil samples from various other locations that were included in the previous slide. This is a trilobite from the Pioche Formation in Nevada. Here is an unidentified type of algae from House Range, Utah. This is an Isoxus from Sirius Peshet, Greenland. Again, though lesser known than the Burgess Shale Formation or the Chenzheng fossil site, these locations are still home to important pieces of geological history and should be treated as such. To conclude, I'd just like to reinforce the importance of the Cambrian Explosion as a slice of time in Earth's history. In just a relatively short amount of time, The Cambrian explosion questioned Darwin's theory of natural selection, kick-started the major evolution of complex life on Earth by the formation of hard parts, and had the highest rate of organism growth ever recorded. Going off of that, organisms developed into eukaryotes, meaning they were multicelled and their cell nucleuses could hold genetic information. Listed here are the references that I've used to give this presentation. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please forward them to my email listed on this slide. I hope you are all doing well, and I wish you a fantastic summer.